Everyone. So we are starting a new episode or a new topic. We've been covering so far all the various belief systems that are linked to what we would call a religious belief, a belief in, for making simplicity, a God, a supreme being, a being that would explain the origin of the universe and attempt to explain our purpose and what ultimately the creator of all things has in store for us. But of course, to do that, one would be to substantiate that there is a God in the first place, of course, and we will be doing that. We will be covering that in later episodes, because as a Christian, I will, of course, be covering Christianity as the best and only truth in the belief in God and the reality of that belief, which I'm going to substantiate rather significantly. It's going to be quite a journey for those who want to join me in that process. It will probably take about 3 or 4 episodes because it is going to be very substantial, while at the same time hopefully a bit interactive as well. We'll see if people want to join and get to the point where we can start to have some open discussions, because so far the ones that we have discussed are clearly the case where they simply cannot be true. I just cannot accept, for the reasons I've given, which I will go into more detail later on in further episodes, that the Muslim faith, I'm afraid, cannot be true on so many levels. The same for Mormonism, LDS, Seventh-day Adventist, and we also looked at Jehovah's Witnesses, all of which, based on the detail, if you like, when we start uncovering the layers of those belief systems, we can see clearly that they cannot be true, cannot be from God, because God, as our concept is very clear, the creator of all things, the most intelligent being, if you like, would certainly not be flawed with human limitations. It would not be an essence that would be void of truth, an essence that would be inconsistent, contradictory, and so on. It's got to be in all those positive qualities. It's got to be absolute in each one. And I will accept to some degree that isn't always so easily provable, of course, but what we can do is eliminate belief systems purely on the basis of where it clearly isn't true, clearly is contradictory. Then there's a case that can be eliminated. And one of the problems we got here, where we're going to talk about atheism, is this whole misconception. And I want to start from the very, very beginning here, is the conception of that atheism is looking at the proof that there is no God, but it seems to be doing so on the basis of looking at religion. And that's not what I want to do. And to prove atheism is false is to say, well, let's compare it to religion, because religion is really more about a human connection with the belief in God based on its own preconceived ideas, etc. And where there may be flaws in those ideas, you could see where that is the case. So I'm just checking if we can see that I'm online. Okay, I am live, and I've got, not sure what's the story here. Well, anyway, I'm on live. I don't know why some people can't see me. Hopefully there's no issue with that. If so, what I will do is I'll probably republish the recording anyway on YouTube, and a link in other mediums and formats as well. So basically what I was saying there is that it's not about religion per se, because that's simply the byproduct of a human link and connection to a belief in God. It's not the belief in God itself. So it's not the basis that we believe by looking at religion to prove there is a God. So atheism can't at the same time prove there isn't a God by looking at religion. because you can find flaws in religion because it's a human's endeavor to link to that God, not the evidence of God itself, if you see what I'm saying. So that's one of the flawed arguments that atheism use a lot. Not all, of course. Some are a bit more sensible and say, okay, I just don't believe the concept of God, that there is this all-knowing, all-wise creator that always existed. Now, half the issue we've got with that, of course, is we are talking about a concept that isn't provable in the absolute sense, because we have the limitation of us as humans to be able to prove something that never had a beginning, and something that is all powerful, all knowing, and so on and so on. We simply can't prove it in an absolute sense based on our limitation, but we don't necessarily need to. The reason being is not everything, even if an atheist, as an atheist who may be watching this, would agree that not everything that you agree to and accept do you know for sure. There are many things that you have a belief in, a faith, if you like. A faith is where it's not an absolute certainty, and there's an element of the unknown, but the confidence is strong enough that in all cases of probability that the end result will be favorable, and now you have a faith in that case. I'll give you a silly example, just that one I can think off the top of my head. If I roll a dice to throw a 6, we know that it's only 1 in 6 chance. It's not a strong faith-based position to say I'm going to roll a 6. However, if I say I'm going to roll the dice 100 times, and at least one time in all those 100 times a 6 would appear, then your confidence is high. It's not a certainty, because you could possibly roll every other number bar 6, but the probability is very, very small. So it would be 5 6 to the power of 100. It would be the probability of 1 against that. So it's 0.00001, you know, very, very unlikely, because with so many rolls, you're going to roll a 6 fairly soon. If you've rolled it 1,000 times, you know, it just gets more and more ridiculous, to the point where, though it's not a certainty, you're basing it on the reality of the likelihood of it happening. And that is a faith-based position. So even atheists have faith-based positions on things. So you can't eliminate the fact that faith exists. A belief in something that is not certain exists and is rational. That's how we work as humans. That's our human nature. Not everything is based on absolute scientific or whatever kind of methodology of a level of certainty. And that's the same with, even you look at science. Science is based on facts, but it's actually not quite true. It's based on a high level of facts, but not all of it is facts. Some of it is still experimental. It's still, shall we say, 90% likely. There is still an element of uncertainty. The reason why we know that is we know that science have backtracked, re-evaluated its situation, changed some of its known so-called laws and theories or whatever. Don't forget it has theories, of course. There's a bit of a clue in the name. So that's all part of the general, even consensus as a scientist, that it tries to be as factual as it can based on what we would say is certain. We know gravity is pretty much certain as a known scientific fact, but not everything within science is absolutely known for a fact. But it has levels of probability, you know, that it's very likely to happen or very likely to be true, but not absolutely certain. When I say absolute, I mean 100%. There's no room for doubt or error, in case you want to be sure about my terminology here. I don't want to be caught up with all these terminologies. So I want to really make it simple, clear, and how we look at these concepts. So with atheism, there's been this huge, I mean, starting from the very beginning, this huge idea that science is all based on just absolute and only facts, and which is linked to science, linked to the natural world and the investigation, discovery of what we have found out about the natural world. And that's all what atheism is doing, is that because of those facts, and that's only what it looks at, it cannot prove there's a God, because it can't factually prove there's one. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that's not strictly true. I give you some silly examples here, clear examples. Not all scientists, of course, are atheists. A lot of scientists are actually theists. So it isn't because of science that determines whether something is true or false, whether in terms of whether there's a God. It just provides evidence about factual events that we can establish in the world we live in. And that only, again, is very limited. I mean, scientists would agree, as much as they have an incredible advancement in knowledge and scientific discovery, they still know a very, very, very tiny amount of the universe. There's 99.999% of the universe, it still is unknown to it. It doesn't know if there are further universes. You know, there is this thing which we have discovered is the Earth is expanding, the universe is expanding, which if you want to reverse engineer that, when you can go back, it means it must have been less and less of a universe the further you go back, which kind of logically makes sense. And I think that's an acceptable option. So, hi, brother Jason. Just sent me a good message there. He's going to copy the link to his stream. That's nice of him. Thank you, brother. I hope you're well, Jason. Been thinking and praying about you recently. So this whole thing about the existence of the universe coming from a more simpler source makes sense because it's expanding. The opposite of expanding means it was less than it was when it expanded previously. And you keep going back, it will be less and less and less till you get to what you call a point in time where you could say is kind of the beginning of the universe. Now, to just change the terminology a bit, let's call the universe matter, just to make this whole thing a bit easier to comprehend. Matter is simply the material world we live in. It's in all many different forms. You know, you've got a sort of static matter, which is just matter that just like, I don't know, wood, rock, whatever, just exists, versus a more living type of matter. I mean, it's all living in a way, but living in a matter where it has the ability to grow, develop, has cells that reproduce, living matter in the terms of animal, plants, etc. You can see the distinction. And of course, the distinction is that that's inanimate objects versus animate objects, which can develop, adjust, and perform in a very different way. And we wouldn't be too clever to simply agree the distinction between the two. When we're looking at an animal, when we're looking at a piece of rock, we're not saying they're one of the same thing. And I'm sure any atheist would agree there is a very, very clear distinction. There's a reason why I'm saying this early on, because you're going to see later on how this all plays a part. Back to my expanding universe thing, which most atheists agree with. And I mean, the evidence is there, so I wouldn't disagree with it either, that the universe is clearly expanding. There's no reason why you would say otherwise. The evidence is 100% there in terms of some evidence is there to prove that point. What we don't have, of course, is a recorder to go back far enough to prove it, that this is a process or way that always was the way, and that's how things became. But it's a very good logical inference to suggest that that is kind of how the universe progressed from a whatever size of matter to then expand to the universe we know. Now, that's not proving there's a God. That's not proving there is no God. It's just at least trying to define some terms on how the universe started. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If we base it purely on matter, which is what we call, I think that the latest theory on this has its variants of it, but it's otherwise known as the Big Bang, simply explains it this way, that there was some form of matter, which was basically inanimate. It didn't involve, as far as we know, living cells or living organisms or whatever. It's just simply matters like rock as we know it, some form of rock, maybe complex in some ways, but basically just rock. And what simply happened is at some point, again, scientists do not know the answer. It exploded, and once it exploded, it, if you like, was the beginning of the process of the development of the universe. Now, from an atheist point of view, that explosion was simply came about without any, shall we say, orchestrated design behind it. It wasn't started from some intelligent design, some maker, somebody with intelligence that orchestrated this explosion in a, shall we say, organized way. But if there is no God, then of course there wouldn't be that organization, that intelligence behind it, and it would therefore be reliant purely on natural processes. And that's what we're going to start looking at, to see if some of these explanations of this natural process really actually make sense. Oh, really? Are you atheists really out there just kind of accepting a lot of this without really being able to stop and think, does it actually hold up to scrutiny? And that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to do this in a number of different ways. We're going to start by tonight just going over the basic, if you like, introduction of these premises to why this whole argument kind of falls flat on its face from an atheist position, and why it needs to be re-looked at, and the theist position really needs to be genuinely considered as a result. And we can't just, as an atheist, or those who are atheists, I should say, cannot really continue, if they're being honest with themselves, to just run with this theory without fully looking into the detail to support it. And I would highly recommend and suggest, as you're going to see through the weeks, that there is a need for investigation. There is a need to uncover the layers and look behind what really makes up the whole atheist position, and whether there is any credibility for it to be a genuine contender for a belief system that we should hold to. Now, my argument as a Christian is no, the argument is massively flawed, significantly flawed. But what's going to get very interesting, not tonight so much, but in weeks to come, is there is a lot of new discoveries, a lot of new information out there that really does fly in the face of the atheist position. There is so much more substantial evidence now to show that the atheist position is significantly flawed, and therefore, by default, the theist position, or the intelligent design, if you like, source of the universe, is a much more feasible option. Not only is it a bit more feasible, of course, because we're going to take it to another level where the basis of more, or probability of more likely, the more stronger position as a theist is then translates into reality through a number of events that's taken place and still continue to take place as evidence that there is a God. And I would say that that evidence can only be proven in a more significant and clear way than as a Christian, because I believe that Christian is the only way, because Christianity is really looking at all the sources, all the evidence, and putting a case that ties it all in accurately with no gaps, no errors, no contradictions, no clear cases going against what we would understand God to be, and so forth. And it's only in that Christian position can you have that evidence, which is then also backed up by the real life personal experience of every Christian, every genuine Christian, that they have, that it's not just a theory, but it's a real-time reality in their lives. And I can certainly vouch for that in my life when I see how God has been personally involved in answering my prayers, done some wonderful things. I mean, I had a major back issue years ago, which I was prayed for. I got instantly healed. You know, you just can't make these things up. No atheist could explain how somebody just praying for you could heal a major back issue. And I had a major back issue. I mean, I had x-rays that showed the evidence of it, and they said there's only major surgery, which is one, expensive, and two, risky. Is the only option, because they couldn't guarantee that it'd be successful, and it could actually make the situation worse. I ended up getting prayed for and healed. So these are the kind of parts of the evidence why I say Christianity is true. There's a lot more to it, but that's just one little small snippet of what's to come. So tonight we really are going to look at this overview, if you like, on the argument why we believe atheism just simply cannot be true. And to do that, I'm also going to unpack a bit more about what the atheist position is, because I think that also needs to be clear, because just for those who are not aware of this, there is no such thing as an atheist position. Let me explain what I mean by that. Of course, there's an atheist position, but what I mean is it's not just one singular position, one singular understanding, theory, whatever. It's multiple. And there are many versions, if you like, of the atheist position, depending which type of atheist you speak to. So this is where the nuances come in about the detail of what an atheist believes or disbelieves, etc. But what we're going to do is, with all those different variations, is simply say, well, they all do come under the umbrella of a general overriding position, which is what we're going to look at. What I mean by that is, irrespective of what type of atheist you are, you're not going to disagree with any of these premises I'm about to provide tonight. They're all going to fit, every single one, to a degree, of your position. So I'm not giving the atheist a false position. I'm not going to represent them in a false way. I'm trying to be as accurate as I can and honest and genuine as I can to what the atheist position is. And this is based on lots of different studies, statements, etc., that have, if you like, provided a clear case of what basically the atheist position is. Now, first and foremost, and let me just pause here a second, I just need to have a drink. Right, the first and foremost clear position of an atheist is simply to say that there is no God. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that there's simply no God. What they really mean is there is no powerful creator with intelligence design that is behind all things. If you like, the opening or beginning of creation as we know it, of this universe, came from some intelligent source. We call it God, but you don't have to necessarily call it God. Let's, for argument's sake, it's just some sort of intelligent source. Because that will open loads of questions, of course. If the whole of the universe started from some intelligent source, then that begs the question, what is that intelligent source? The next thing that begs that question is, did that intelligent source have a beginning? You then get into, I think I mentioned this already, you get into this infinite regression situation. If that had a source, then where was the source for that? And so on and so on. So ultimately, one of the logics, even though we can't prove it, of course, it's beyond our comprehension, is whatever that beginning was, must be something that always existed. It has to be outside of time and space for that to logically make sense. Otherwise, you get this infinite regression where you never get to a beginning of what really started the universe. Because whatever that start was, where did that start come from? You still have that same dilemma, if you like. So that's part of the challenge. It doesn't mean that God isn't true or an intelligent source is not true, just because we can't fundamentally in our head work out how can something not have a beginning. Because we still have the same problem. If it does have a beginning, where did that come from? So you're still no better off. And so therefore, the logic of saying that whatever did was the beginning, if you like, of the universe as we know it, itself could not have had a beginning. And that's the logical inference, if you like. And there can only be one of those two options, of course, because they are literally covering the 100% option of either there is a beginning or not, to try and find the source. So there are, if you like, as a result, cases where just because we can't explain everything, it doesn't mean our explanation is faulty or it can be dismissed. And that's the same with atheism. It's logic that it produces still has to be substantiated, and it has to use the same level of inference, the same level of logic and reasoning it does to a theist position as it has to do to itself. It cannot exclude its own rationality just because it hasn't got answers to certain things, and somehow it's got some privilege where it can hide, if you like, from being able to be scrutinized or challenged with some of its theories or whatever. Because I know one of the things that bug me a bit is when atheists usually come up with the line, well, we're still in progress, scientists are still looking into it, we don't have an answer. But if you still don't have an answer, then don't be so sure that your answer, your position is correct. If you still are under the position where there's still a level of unanswered questions, if you like. But yet when it comes to the theist position, an atheist will say, well, no, that clearly cannot be true. That cannot be true. But you see that can you see the kind of what's a good word for this? The double standards. You know, from a theist position where you've got doubts and still uncertainties because you're still researching, still discovering, that is okay. But when it comes to theist position, you don't apply the same rule where we don't have answers to everything. Therefore, we're still in progress to maybe learn and discover more about this intelligent designer, which we call God. Like, how is it they never had a beginning? Doesn't exclude the fact that it may still be true. And that's my point. It doesn't therefore use the same rule of thumb, if you like, the same logical inference, that therefore you can eliminate it to say can't be true. The atheist cannot do that. So you've got to be careful that they can't use these double standards. So now that we've got that out of the way, and good evening, Annie, welcome. Evening to you, a lovely sister from America. So atheism, let's start to look at some of these arguments at a very top level. As I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail tonight. I want to take this step by step because I really want to make sure that we have a really good understanding of the atheist position and how it logically cannot make sense and where there is basically flaws in the argument that people seem to just dismiss. They seem to just think, oh, can't be a God. One good explanation, which I think is a fair explanation without going into detail, is look at the state of the world, how wicked it is. How can there be a God if he allows all this wickedness? It's a very good question and a valid question. But that doesn't disprove there isn't a God. It just says, okay, we have some issues here. Fine, I accept that the world is a mess at the moment. There's so much wickedness going on. There's so much corruption and inhumanity, and lots of things that aren't right, and so on and so on. It's not good for sure. But again, that's not the basis to prove if there's a God or not. Of course, those questions do need to be answered, and we will do that. We will answer those questions when it comes to the case of Christianity, which will be coming up later on. Where are we now? 10th of September. Probably might start in a couple of weeks' time. I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks' time, or maybe beginning of October. But it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm going to almost suggest it's going to be a little bit unique because I'm going to try and explain Christianity in a slightly different way than I've kind of been familiar with when I've looked and researched on a lot of ways that people have brought the case for Christianity, and all of them have been very valid. But I want to bring in a slightly different angle to hopefully help complement all the various different ways that the proof of God, proof of Christianity is true, can be put together. So now I've mentioned that, let's get back to our argument. So our arguments I'm going to be starting with tonight is this very basic overview of where we see major flaws with the basic premise of atheism. So let's do that. So let me just bring up my notes. Where did I put those? Here we go. Right, okay. So one of the things that we're going to uncover, if you like, is this whole thing about the atheist position. So the fundamental position with atheism, which is quite startling, and maybe not even that readily known by many, and that is that truth and reason are not in agreement. Sorry, I've got that wrong. So the truth of atheism, versus reasoning. So versus reasoning. So basically, atheism is not looking at reason. It's not fundamentally designed to accept reasoning as a truth statement to atheism. Now, that may be a little of a surprise. So we're going to unpack that in a second, because basically atheism is saying it's based on purely on truths as we know them, that are just what we call determined. It's like the natural way the world works. And naturalism, there are these theories called naturalism, determinism, basically saying in essence that things are just naturally occur as they do from the Big Bang, based on events that we have no control over. They just naturally happen as they happen, and we're just, if you like, passengers of that process, watching that development of evolution process just unfold in front of our eyes, and we are just observers of this, if you like. And we and therefore anything that we do in terms of our reasoning and our reasonable faculties that we're trying to approach in this argument, therefore are, if you like, simply cannot exist. They can't complement this whole naturalism, determinism process, which is what atheism is really comes under, if you like. And that's, like we were saying, that the most common position, as there are many positions of atheism, is this one called naturalism. That basically everything exists on the basis that it's purely based on these material things, and that's it. So we have the Big Bang, piece of material, rock, whatever. No one really knows. No atheist scientists know this, or any scientists really know that even if there was a Big Bang, which there could quite easily have been, it doesn't prove or disprove there's a God, of course. It just proves at some point there could have been an explosion of matter. But the fact that matter as a material process then just goes through this natural evolutionary process of getting bigger and more parts, expanding. From that, we get the universe as we know it. Somehow we have the Earth. We have this incredibly fine-tuned universe, and we have all the inhabitants of animals, creatures, plants, and humans existing on it. So you can see how this is starting to sound a bit far-fetched already, but that's purely based on that naturalistic process. Now, there is another form of atheism, which, even though it takes that into consideration, and we call that a closed case, by the way. So it's just defined in that manner, and there is really no room outside of that. That's what I mean by closed case, to suggest any other kind of argument. But there are some atheists that kind of realize the flaw in that argument. It cannot be purely on the simplicity of that, because again opens the absolute floodgates of reason, rationality, morality, and so on, that just simply haven't been taken into account. And if you do take them into account, if we are purely going based on a natural process, therefore it basically clashes. It goes against the grain of that natural process. And we're going to see why in a second. So they do have this open discussion that there may be some more argument over some variation on this, and they use things like Plato, which rationalizes certain these theories and reasonings to suggest there is some kind of former power, some form of whatever. But then again, that's hardly supporting the argument of atheism. It's more supporting the argument that there is some kind of how do I put it, form of intelligence or form of superior source to kind of rationalize, the universe, if you like, and therefore, if we are purely going based on a natural process, therefore it cannot be purely on the simplicity of that, because again opens the floodgates of the kind of world that we live in. The fact that we as humans are the way we are, with the thought process we have, the mind that we have, that doesn't fit well with this general materialistic understanding, of course. And again, that just then begs the question, maybe there is more to it. It cannot be simply just some kind of natural deterministic kind of evolutionary process, and that's it, because it doesn't fit the model of the way we see, especially in terms of humankind and how unique we are as humans. So if you're going to believe it as an atheist, then you've got a huge problem to try and explain this natural world when you see things that are in front of you which goes against the grain of that natural process. If we have a natural process, why do we even have morality? It makes no sense. There's no morality. It's all subjective. It's just, in fact, it gets in the way of natural process, But we can see the value of these moral perspectives. So it can't be just ignored in that way. So this is where we got the conflict, major conflict, in fact. And this is the arguments we're going to go through now to kind of unpack some of these at a top level, of course. And I'm no scientist, I'm no expert on this matter. I mean, I have studied science, I did study at school and so on, but I'm not for 1 second professing I'm an expert on the matter. But there are lots of studies that have been conducted, and there is a lot of research done where we can unpack some of that details. And all I will do is try and help the audience, those that are listening in, to try and explain it in a simpler way as possible, so that I can get as many people, shall we say, clear and understandable on these subject matter and how these things are explained. Because obviously, when you go down the scientific route, especially, it does get rather complex. And even I'm no expert myself, so I don't really understand the absolute detail of some of this theory and research. But when it comes to the arguments themselves, you don't necessarily need that level of detail. You just need to unpack it to a reasonable level where you can see from that point where it actually logically makes sense. And if it clearly doesn't, you don't really need to worry about looking into any deeper. There are researchers and experts who have done, and all they're really doing is supporting their argument even further. So what I want to do is at least get it to a reasonably good level, which makes the argument sound. And so we're going to start at this very top level to begin with, and then unpack some of these theories in future weeks. So the first one I'm going to look at, which is probably the most common argument of an atheist, is this epistemological argument. And that basically is this, that if atheism is true, then any belief is sustained and produced by natural processes, which goal is not truth. Let me just reread that again. If atheism is true, then it's based on the sustained and produced by natural processes. This natural process, like I mentioned, from the Big Bang, this evolutionary process that naturally just occurs on its own. It's not going to be blocked by anything else, any kind of truth, any kind of opinion, view, you name it. It's simply going to happen, part of its natural process. It's completely independent, if you like. So the question then begs the question is, why would we believe that is true? Because basically what that means is that, this is where it gets quite ridiculous, I think, is that's basically saying that atheism is based on that there is no intelligent design of the universe, and there is no intelligence behind the universe working with the universe in its natural process. It's just doing its own thing. If you think about a clump of matter, and okay, it could be huge, of course, it could be, I don't know, 50 billion tons in material weight, if it could be weighed and exploded. If there is no intelligent design behind it, then you're expecting no intelligence to be working with it. It's just going to occur in its natural way. And if this has been happening for billions and billions of years, that natural process is therefore capable of working without any intelligence behind it, without any intelligent assistance in its process. Based on this theory, an atheist would have it that for billions of years, where there was no life forms, no plants, no animals, no humans, because we have absolutely no evidence of anything of that nature that far back. We know we have discovery and fossilization records, etc., of animal life going back so far, but no way billions of years. So an atheist would agree that a lot of this process was simply a matter going through an evolutionary process. And this is a process, therefore, without any rational function. It just happens the way it happens. There's no mind behind it. This is my point. It's just simply a process that just naturally occurs on its own. It won't involve any form of intelligent mind design, if you like, behind it. And that's where it gets interesting. So what about our minds? In a natural process, how on earth do we end up with the minds that we've got, with rationality, with thought process, with the ability to consider, different positions on things that go against the grain of a natural process? Somebody came to me the other day, I thought it was a really, really good point. If we went by purely natural processes, why is it that we have people that make decisions that completely go against that? For example, why would somebody, for example, choose to enroll in the army, maybe not even in their own country necessarily, to sacrifice their life for somebody they don't even know? That's not conforming to natural process at all. It's looking at a completely different aspect. This is this moral aspect, which is, from an atheist point of view, abstract. It's not rational. It's just some kind of, I don't know, unexplainable process that doesn't fit natural causes, natural processes. But yet we can all agree we have them. We all have this amazing mind that produces some sort of rationality. But it goes beyond that. It doesn't also create some form of rationality, but it holds on to what? Truths. It holds on to truths. And what are those truths? They're not part of any natural process, because as I said, this is just a clump of matter expanding, exploding, expanding, whatever, over billions of years. And you're just seeing that naturally unfold and play out. No need for anybody to stop and think, okay, does it matter how I feel today, or what I fancy doing today, or whether I want to do something good for somebody? It is irrelevant. It's not even a contender. It just happens the way it happens. So why have we got these minds with these qualities? And not only have we got these minds with qualities, but look how amazing they are. I mean, there is, okay, I agree there's some differences, but we do have a common theme, that truths are based on good, bad, and so on. You can categorize helping each other out, having a love for each other, having all these positive qualities of good, more what we call good, as a positive thing. And we all kind of share and agree, if we're in good mental health, on those qualities. We don't disagree that, being nice to somebody, being courteous, being friendly is a bad thing. I mean, nobody would rationally agree that. We have these very clear concepts of good and bad, and we all seem to have this within us. You don't see anybody really disagreeing with that. I said there are exceptions where I would say, don't think that we are influential to some bad thoughts. And of course, people with free will do have the ability to look at these options and maybe make some bad choices, because they can say, okay, I can be selfish. I know it's wrong, but if I get away with it, there's no God. Who's to stop me from, as long as I get away with it, I can do it. So you're going to have that occurring as well. But we do all necessarily fundamentally agree as a human race what is good and what is bad. And these are the morals that are within our mind, that are rational, that, as I said, goes completely against the grain of the evolutionary natural process. And that's my point. It therefore asks, how can we purely believe in this epistemological solution or argument when we have this truth claim about this mind of ours, which then begs the question, where do we get this mind from? This couldn't be part of this natural process, because it goes, as I said, goes completely against it. And that's where the argument of intelligence, design, and if you like, orchestrator of our minds, the source of our minds, must be coming from some other form, from some other source. It can't be just purely from this natural process, because the natural process doesn't accommodate it. And because we are talking about very sophisticated, I would say a human being is a very sophisticated creature, because look at what we've accomplished as humans over the thousands of years. It shows the potential and ability of humans. That, to me, when you look at, as I say, I went back to this probability thing, the probability that all that came by purely somehow through these natural processes, some kind of offshoot, or I don't know, accident, if you like, almost, that we somehow got these qualities when we don't really need them from the natural process. Why have we got them in such a sophisticated way, in such a precise way, in such a consistent way? That all points, in terms of probability, to an intelligence design behind it. And that's my point. That's really, from that argument, this whole natural process falls down, because it cannot accommodate this truth claim of the rational minds that we have as humans and all the connotations that go with it. And that's the funny thing, is as an atheist, they're using their rational thinking in the first place to try and exclude it as an option within their theory in the first place. But that's exactly the concept they're using. So maybe what they're saying don't even make sense, because it's rational, it's using our minds, and we shouldn't be doing it because we're just part of some natural process. So it really is almost a bit conflicting in a way, but contradictory, I would say, even, and this whole thought process. So anyway, that's the first point. This whole thing about this epistemological argument falls flat on its face on the basis that it's not just that natural process that's occurring here. There's far more to it. And what is far more to it in terms of the truth and the mind and the morality of humans completely goes against the whole concept of this process. So it leaves an unanswered question significantly in the scheme of things. Which leads me to point two, that the universe is very different to humans, because this natural process doesn't care about these rational thoughts, about these concepts of morality, etc. It just cares about its process. And you can see that in natural processes. You see around us when you look at, the sun, stars, the days, the change of seasons, whatever it may be, the way that the planets orbit around the universe, etc., etc. They just happen out of a process, and they will happen no matter what, because it just does what it does. And if that's all there was, then I would say the argument sticks. But this is where the indifference, if you like, of the human capacity simply doesn't fit that model at all. Because this is the key bit here. Atheism, on the basis of this process, doesn't take into account truth. It doesn't take into account morality. It completely is devoid of those rationales, if you like, or areas of truth or understanding, or whatever you want to call it. It's just simply doesn't consider and incorporate them in its process. It's purely random, and it's purely, as it just happens how it happens. It's not contrived or orchestrated by any outer source. It just does its thing, and it's determined to its particular result. to fulfill that result, and that's it. It doesn't stop and think, well, maybe tomorrow I'll just have a break and do something else, or consider anything else. It just does its thing, very deterministic in that sense, and therefore completely excludes any rational thoughts that I'm talking about in terms of rational truths around morality, etc., because they simply are not accommodating such positions. The next one, I don't really know this one so well, but I'll just read this out. It's called the Plantinga's, apologize for my terrible pronunciation, Plantinga's evolutionary argument. In fact, this is actually a very good argument against atheism, actually. So it's not an argument towards atheism. Given evolution and atheism, our minds evolve not according to searching for truth, but according to what is useful for survival. So this is a very good point here. If we go through the natural process, if we do end up having a mind, the mind should be working as in conjunction with that evolutionary process. But you can clearly see it doesn't. We are here not purely to survive, even though survival is important, but it's also far more than that. It's all about also the search for truth, the search for meaning in life, and so on. So there is there's obviously a big gap between just believing it from an evolutionary, deterministic process, than the belief in truth and meaning and so on. So in other words, we can have thoughts that are meaningful, but it could also be false. But if it was purely on a natural process, then we wouldn't have the ability to be able to search for truths if they existed. It purely would be just on the basis of survival. And that's the point. The argument is therefore, because we can see that it's far more meaningful. There are clearly identified truths. There's clearly identified moral standards of what is good and what is bad. They simply prove it cannot be purely this so-called natural process. So in other words, our makeup is not purely designed 100% for the basis of survival. If it was, then I think there'll be some argument here that maybe there is a natural process that somehow evolved in some kind of existence and survival to exist, incorporated in that process. That may be to a degree an argument, and I think that would be a valid argument up to a certain point. Still wouldn't totally solve it, but I think it would be an argument to some degree. But we don't have to worry about that because we know it goes beyond that, because our natural being as humans is far more significant than just simply being a body, a creature that simply acts to survive. You see that in animals. Yes, there's that instinct to purely survive, and it's a very simplistic case. I'm not saying for all animals, but certainly for a lot of animals, you see it's purely a case of survival, and that is very much a process you can see evident, but not in humans. You definitely cannot see that purely in humans. We can see there is far more to life than purely thinking about survival. Like I mentioned earlier, why would we be even thinking about sacrificing ourselves for others if it was purely a case of just survival? Why do we have all these virtues of love and virtuous qualities of morality if it was purely a case of survival? The two just, they're just worlds apart. They're completely, they're not in line at all. And that's where that whole argument fails, because we know that these qualities exist within us. There's no question of that at all. This, just to further that point, natural selection here doesn't simply care about truth, because truth is irrelevant to them. It will just do its process nevertheless. Let me put it another way. If I remove all the truth that exists in the world, we didn't have it. We're just like no different to all the other creatures, just We're just almost like animals, if you like, in the sense that we just, reproduce, we eat, we feed, we protect, we stay alive, we fight our corners, defend ourselves to stay alive, like all animals do. And that's all there is to it. And maybe you got a point. But we have a body, a mind that goes far beyond that, goes completely against the grain of that rational thinking. And that there's much more to the way that we are, which again suggests that there must be more to the source of where we came from in the first place. Okay. And this is again, I like to use it because I'm a bit of a maths man myself, if you haven't worked that bit out. And one of my favorite subjects was actually probability, funny enough. So that's the thing I just ended up enjoying, don't know why. But of course, a lot of this, I really want to really make it clear. A lot of these things can't be absolutely proven, but it doesn't mean they're not true. Even from an atheist position, like I said at the beginning, what an atheist position is doesn't make it absolutely true. It's still a theory. It's still, and they would agree, that's the best answer we've got for now. Further science, further research, whatever, will uncover more discovery and so on. But it's still just a theory. But what the theory is based on is the most likely probability of it being true. So then let's take that same theory and apply it to humans. With an intelligent mind, a rational mind with morality and truth, reasoning faculty that we have, what is the probability of that just occurring through a natural process that doesn't care, doesn't need or require those qualities to then develop and come about in humankind the way it has, versus that there is some definite design and intelligence behind it that they will then explain where the source of that mind and that rationality and those truths come from. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. You've got to at least admit as an atheist that the probability that it comes from something of similar, if you like, qualities, because we're talking about intelligence here, we're talking about human intelligence, which, as we can see, is very sophisticated, especially in terms of when you look at man today and what we've accomplished as a human race. It clearly proves that, and you've got some examples as well of some very intelligent people. Why would that not logically infer that it must be a source of some sort of intelligence behind it? That is the more likely of the probabilities of the two. And as I said, the natural process we see doesn't all of a sudden come out and stop and reconsider its position because of some truth or some rationale, moral position or whatever. It just simply doesn't. It just happens through its natural process, devoid of these qualities. And that's really, if you want to start getting philosophical, why would you even go down this argument to say that there cannot be God when this is pointing to an intelligence? And the source of an intelligence is what's then under question, not whether there's an existence of this intelligence, but just what that intelligence is, if that makes sense. Now, here's a little example that somebody wrote. I'm going to just read this one out to kind of make you think a bit more about this. Let's say that I had a drug called a matrix that makes you rationally process heavily unreliable. So basically, this drug is messing your head up, so you can't think straight, and therefore all your rational process is just all over the place, and therefore can't be relied on. It's so powerful that you're also unable to be self-aware of what you believe and whether it's true or not. So this is obviously a serious drug we're talking about. Given that proposition, that our minds were formed purely for survival, then the probability would be very similar that our minds would simply be unreliable. It couldn't have some form of truth, because the probability of that is just so unlikely that we can form this level of truth if we just come from just natural processes. It's no different to this drug, is the point being made here, because all it would do is produce a very unreliable mind. If you think about, say, for example, we had, I don't know, 1 billion explosions of matter, all scattering off. And through that, each one of those came some form of life, as we know it, maybe with a mind similar to ours. Realistically, what is the probability that all those minds are all uniform? They're all in agreement. They're all rational, and they're not all over the place and irrational and all the rest of it. The probability to producing a reliable mind that is coherent, that is consistent, is stupidly unlikely from an atheist position. If there's no God, for that to naturally occur, the probability is just as good as impossible. It's just not really. But that's the position that an atheist has to take if there's no God. It just natural processes can't produce a reasonable mind in this way, especially with the qualities we talked about. So here's the point. Therefore, with the level of cognitive faculties that we have and the reliability of those faculties of our mind, when you think about it, apart from when people have some mental issues or whatever, we all will have issues from time to time. But generally, when you look at man and the mind of humankind, there is a very, very strong reliability right across humans, right across the world, all through the years of this consistently reliable mind that we have. We can rely on it because we can rely on it based on what it produces. We can rely on it in terms of what we see as morally true versus what is morally false, in terms of our behavior, rationale, logic. It's not all chaotic. It's very, very controlled. It's very, very consistent and reliable, which then begs the question, surely that level of reliability must come from some intelligent design, compared to it not coming from an intelligent design, because the output, the results, do not suggest it's just some random process, part of this, natural process that doesn't really consider or incorporate this element. It's just random, processes that occur. From that perspective, that is not random in a complete sense, but random in the sense that it's not going to form a mind and all of a sudden a rationale with truths and morality that's going to be consistent across the whole of the human race, for example. Again, this is going towards the evidence or stronger evidence there must be some intelligent design behind it. Otherwise, why have we got the minds we've got? In other words, it just simply doesn't make sense. And that's one of the strong arguments against atheism, is why on earth would we believe in any of this if it's purely on the basis that there is no intelligent design behind it? We as humans are an incredibly great evidence or a case for God or a case for an intelligent design than anything else, because of the way we are and the consistency of it. So there's another argument by Dr. Slagle, discovers another argument that leads to a problem here in atheism reasoning. The argument is that this determinism, because we have no free will. If determinism was true, our beliefs are not determined by free will or rational beliefs, but just formed from a simple process. But we do have free will. I think that you can't argue. I mean, you would be crazy to argue that we don't have free will, which goes against the grain of this determined existence, this determined process, this natural process. it will all be predetermined and we will just fit that process. But we don't just fit that process because we go against the grain of that process. We stop and we challenge it and so on. Again, this is all due to our ability to have free will, to reason, rationalize, and make decisions on it and change our course of action as a result. This again goes back to the point that the natural process does not then develop into these level of truths that we're talking about here. There's just no need. It just wouldn't have any need, rationality, or whatever, any kind of explanation that says that we should have some kind of explanation to why we have these truths, these areas of morality and so on, and these levels of mental behavior that we have. It just simply goes against that. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is what we see in terms of our mind and our rationality and our morals and our subjectivity and free will, etc., goes completely against the basic foundation of atheism. Because atheism is without any kind of purpose from that perspective, no intelligent design behind it. It's purely a material, deterministic, natural process, which therefore doesn't require any of these qualities. That's my point. So therefore, the probability for them to exist and the way they exist, the sophisticated way that exists, completely goes against the whole evolutionary process that atheists support. Now, one of the points to that is that atheism leads to, as I said, determinism. And they base this on various scientific evidence. Basically, there's a theoretical physicist called Sabine Hossenfelder demonstrated that free will is incompatible with the laws of nature. The property of the laws of nature means that if you have details of initial conditions, then you can calculate what will happen at all other times given those conditions. So in other words, if you're based on very predetermined processes, then you can calculate what's going to happen next and what's going to happen after that. But then that goes against free will, because free will allows you to, if you like, intervene in that process and go against that process and come out of that process and go a different direction. So in other words, let me get a bit philosophical here. We're saying that with the Big Bang and from these natural processes, everything is already predetermined. And if everything is predetermined, we do not have free will. But we clearly see we do have free will. So not everything is clearly predetermined. Taking the next step, it means, therefore, if everything's predetermined and we don't have free will, we can't have rational thoughts. We can't be considering, what's right, what's morally true, and so on. We can't have all these different thoughts that we have, this ability to rationalize, if we're just already involved in a predetermined process. This completely goes against conflict. It's a conflict of interest between what is an atheist position, if we're going by predeterminism, natural processes, versus the rational mind, free will. But yet we know they exist. So how can they exist if in the predetermined process it's not possible? Nowhere is scientists, or any atheist scientist, I should say, come up with a conclusion to prove that natural process creates free will, rationality, and so on. They agree it's a completely separate process they have no answer for. But more importantly, that's not good enough for me. And it shouldn't be good enough for you, because we're not just saying it's not something that a scientist can't answer. It's something that simply doesn't fit the model. Natural processes that purely happen without an intelligence behind it through determinism would not create the rational mind that we know of, especially when you talk about the level of sophistication of that mind. What is also interesting here, and I'll just make a brief point on this. The rational mind isn't so like just, again, it's not as random and whatever people may say at times. And I can see why they can say at times, but we would all agree, as I said earlier, that our rational mind is pretty consistent across the board. We all kind of know what is good and what is bad. We know what basically truths are. Now, I know that through free will, we can be deceived. I would accept that, and people can twist explanations on meanings. But if you're being honest and truthful, I think we would all very happily and confidently agree that being good to people, we can define what that is. We can define what evil is. We can make a list. And let's just for argument's sake, we all made a list. We would be 99% accurate with that list for the top, say, 20, 30 things that we call good and what we call evil. There'll be some exceptions, of course, because I said people are been somewhat deceived and misled. So there are going to be exceptions. But the consistency shows that there is an innate quality within us of these morals that we live to. They're not just some process that just evolved, because if it was, there'd be inconsistency all over the place. But we don't have that at all. The reality is that we have a very consistent mind that has these innate qualities of evil, morality, good and bad, and so on and so on and so on. And this is what we call this kind of theory of intuition, the definition of intuition. We have this, if you like, examples of intuition working in us, where we can be, where we can put logic together, a rationale together, and look at things in a, from a different perspective. We're not just confined to defined, determined processes, in other words. Like I said, if you didn't have that strong an understanding, say you haven't been educated yet into all truths, all the common truths of good and bad or whatever you, I think we'd all agree that, for example, just killing somebody or torturing somebody just for the fun of it is clearly wrong. It's clearly evil. We wouldn't have an issue with that. And so, again, it leans back to the point that when we look at these cases of reality and the consistency of it, the point being is it points far more likely that there is an intelligent design behind it compared to there not being one. Being purely under the atheist position of this deterministic, materialistic, whatever you want to call it, natural process, evolutionary process, then the probability of this whole innate morality and rationality and free will that we've got simply is just way too unlikely. And that's really the point. So what I'm really saying there is, as an atheist, you really should be looking to what is more logically likely. That should be your basis. That's not to say I'm proving there is a God, but it should be pointing that there is more likely to be intelligent design under what we know of humans to saying there isn't any intelligent design. That's the source of the universe. So, where does that leave us? Well, it produces what we would say here is like a gap between the position of the atheist under its naturalistic, deterministic position versus this whole thing of looking at truth, rationality, free will, and the causes of these things and why we are the human race we are. Why do we do things that go against the grain of these processes? Why do some people You hear sacrificing their lives for others, even people they don't even know. Why would they even do that if that goes against the grain of natural process? Because the process doesn't require this. It's ignorant of all these things. We are the evidence to show that there is intelligence and there is something more to life than just this deterministic process. You could argue as well, why do we even bother to do anything for anyone? Why don't we just be selfish and just, see what we can benefit? We can see the benefit when we eat well, we enjoy life, you enjoy company, friends, have some friends with us, so be able to travel, see the world, and indulge in all the pleasures of life. We could do that in a very selfish way if we wanted to. And if there's no God, if we can get away with it and benefit from the, if you like, exploitation of others, then why not? But somehow something more deeper tells us that's not right. Morally, that's not right. We have a mind to say that there is something far more than just being a dot in the evolutionary process. Our intuition tells us there's more to life than this. There's a reason why we are sometimes unselfish, and why we're sacrificial, and why we look for others, and why we have these moral ground, moral morality within us. The ability to have free will, to decide and be empathetic, to be loving, have all these qualities, these virtues. Unless there was something more to this than just a purely evolutionary process. And that's really where I'm going with this. We've got to be looking at, why are we the way we are as humans? Why are we not considering what that points to? And how reliable are these processes? They're not all over the shop. Even as, like I said earlier, if they did come from some sort of natural process, why is it then with those natural processes that it's so precise, so consistent, so reliable? These natural random processes would certainly make it all over the place, would make it unreliable, and there'll be evidence of it, but we do not see that, because it's only through intelligence, through intelligent design, which we have evidence of, do you get controlled, reliable results. If you think about anything in this world, if you decided to build something or whatever, and you did it purely randomly with no knowledge, no intelligence, and just randomly just threw pieces together, it's a bit like getting a monkey into a room and giving him, I don't know, a book. And so if you leave him in there enough millions and billions of years, eventually he's going to write Shakespeare. Come on, guys. It's not realistic, is it? Randomness produces randomness. Order produces design. Design produces intelligence, or sources, spells out intelligence. We are seeing things that prove intelligence, not disproves it. We can certainly go with many atheist positions on some processes. I don't mind to say that there's a lot of natural processes, but say everything comes from purely those random processes without some kind of intelligence design is billionth to the billionth to the billionth more unlikely than there is an intelligence behind it. Because the argument being is, atheism on its own, without an intelligent design, is way too unreliable to explain these particular laws, moral laws and free will, etc. So you can put as much philosophy on this as you want. You can put as much argument as you want. And I know Plato and others come up with their jumped on the bandwagon with all this. If it was that simple that you can just philosophize these arguments, then you would have a serious level of inconsistency. If this was not reliable because it wasn't based on any kind of intelligent design, then you would see an absolute failure, as well as the success all over the place as a result of that random process, or the lack of intelligent design, if you like, behind it. That's my point. The lack of a real, strong, reliable source only leads to unreliable results. And this is what we're really going to unpack in the future weeks, is looking at the differences between what we see as reliable versus unreliable, what we see as theories when we start to uncover the layers, if you like, of why certain theories cannot be concluded the way they have, and why some new evidence have come forth as well to again point even further towards intelligent design. Now, I'm not saying there's a God just because I'm saying there's intelligent design. That's the next step. But I am going to, in weeks to come, show you how you can go from an intelligent design to a creator of the universe. The creator of the universe is the God as we know it in the Bible, as the document of evidence of God's word, the creator, the intelligent source of the universe. But I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to say, therefore, there is a God. I'm going to prove it in further weeks to come. So from an atheist position, all I'm saying to you atheists out there is at least consider that if you purely look on your naturalistic, deterministic viewpoint, then there should be chaos on any realm of understanding or concept that goes completely against the grain of that process. Free will, rationality, morality, truths, etc., reasoning that we have as humans completely go against, that's my point, this position. So we should see a complete chaos if there's no intelligence behind it. It should just be, some sort of byproduct that's, gone completely wrong. I'm thinking about my car. Funny enough, I've been having some problems with my car. It's been an understatement. As my mistake of buying a diesel. Sorry for those diesel owners out there. But if you don't drive your car good distances, you got this byproduct, as well, going with this argument here, that comes out of the car called soot. It's basically from the diesel petrol. There's this sort of like, I can only describe it as like a soot, which just builds up in your car. And the heat of your engine, if it gets hot enough, can burn these soot off. It's no different to when you think about when you have a fire and you burn the fire, you have a certain soot, but if you have it going long enough, a lot of that soot is burnt off. So when you do long distances in a car, that will burn off the soot and all is good. But what you wouldn't see is there's soot building up as a byproduct, then all of a sudden being something that then is converted into something useful and consistently useful. Maybe somehow this soot builds up, gets recycled, and starts building the engine and correcting the engine in some way, or helps steer your car. It's just matter. It ain't going to care how it comes about. It will just follow the natural process. It's just a product that comes out, or a byproduct that comes out of the oil through that process to leave this soot residue, which then, if you drive it long enough, gets burnt off. I didn't, of course, drive my car long enough because I'm doing all my short journeys. I'm building up soot to the ridiculous level that it then caused issues with my car. So that's my point. Byproducts from natural processes don't produce something that then all of a sudden is meaningful, can have purpose, and do all sorts of clever stuff as a natural result of the process. There is no examples of that. Just no examples of that. Not in a way when we look at rationality and morality. We don't have the soot all of a sudden forming so big that it becomes now a creature and starts walking around the earth with all sorts of ideas. If it did, it would be all over the place, inconsistent and incompatible, like no one's business. You just can't calculate the level of probability of that happening compared to if there was order, there was intelligent design behind it. Then, of course, the probability of the rationality in the mind and the truths that we have exist in the way that it does, in a consistent way it does, is the real argument against atheism. And so atheism has to really address this properly and stop skirting around the idea, well, you can't prove there is a God. You can't prove this, you can't prove that. Well, sorry, Mr. Atheist, you can't prove a ton of stuff on what you believe. You only go based on what the scientists have discovered so far. And as we know, it's still not even 1% of answering all the questions. It's not even 0.0001% of 1% of 1% of the total answer to all the questions of life. We don't even understand life. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we're looking at, we'll go into some detail later about this single cell. This single cell was just some plain little single cell, and then blah, blah, blah. From that, we got this evolutionary process. What we didn't know, there was a world within the cell itself. And a phenomenally complicated coded language sitting in one single cell. You tell me that one single cell just came about with that level of intelligence behind it? It's a bit like getting an empty box. An empty box. And then in that little empty box, somehow, there's a supercomputer sitting inside that little empty box. Just came from nowhere. No design, no intelligence, just appeared through just these random natural processes. What is the probability? It's just not realistic. Are you going to base your whole belief system on these ridiculous theories and rational beliefs on something that is that unlikely, versus what we're clearly seeing is a demonstration of us as humans, the way we are, the way we think, the qualities we have? It all points heavily, hugely, significantly to intelligent design. So you have to then say, okay, can you at least take one leap of faith? Because we all have everything, as I said at the very beginning, involves an element of faith. We don't know absolutely everything, answers everything, but we still exercise faith. Why don't you exercise faith that maybe there is intelligent design? Because that's where the evidence points to, far more likely than not. And that's what I really encourage you all to do, is to start considering as atheists to look at the more likeliness that there is at least intelligence that's behind many things, as we know, especially more than anything, is us humans. I hope that's a help. That's my introduction anyway. I think I've come to pretty much an end to my discussions here. And I think really in conclusion is all I would like to say is that atheism can only lead to an unreliability of minds through this evolutionary process. That's how it naturally can only occur. It can only go through a process if it's determined that it has a lack of any kind of reliability to produce the minds that we have. That's simply the known understanding and process that the atheist position is. But here's the good bit. This is on the basis, more than anything, on scientific laws that they know. Of course, there is a leap of assumption and inference from those beliefs to come to the conclusion there's no God. Well, guess what? That same science that they're using for this level of rationality is also the same science that points to that there is a God. There is intelligence behind it. In fact, there's more likely there is intelligence, because the reason being is this: the difference between the rational thought is on the evolutionary process where they have no answers. They jump in a massive conclusion or assumption based on the lack of evidence to prove their case, because they cannot prove from natural processes or evolutionary process that we could have a consistent, reliable mind that we have as humans. It simply cannot compute that and prove that point. But yet it will not, for some reason, accept, therefore, the possibility that maybe there is intelligence behind it, and let's explore that. That, for me, is a lack of honesty, if you like, in their position, or maybe a lack of ignorance to not even think about it in terms of considering those 2 points. Because for me, they come in hand in hand. You've got to consider both, and you've got to consider the implications of them. The intelligent design is more likely. That's why we would say that's got to be the way, even as an atheist, that you need to explore. So that's how I'm going to end it. Food for thought. For you atheists who have been watching, if you want to jump on next week, we maybe start looking at some specifics on some of the theories, some of the new scientific discoveries. It's going to get very, very interesting. I'll try my best. I will say I probably will succeed not getting it too complicated, because I can't get it too complicated anyway, because I'm no scientist. But I will do my endeavor best to try and simplify some of these discoveries and theories and research to kind of unpack this even more. And hopefully at the end of it, you're going to start to realize that there must be a God. And then ultimately, when we start touching on Christianity, you will be convinced there is one. And that's the whole purpose of my ministry, to get to truth. And that truth ultimately leads to there is a God, a loving God that cares for us and is there for us and has much more in store for us than this life as we know it. Well, thanks for listening. Hour and a half, okay, not bad. I wasn't sure how long this was going to take. So thanks for listening, and until next week, have a blessed week. And until then, take care for now.